Courage, after all, is not being unafraid, but doing what needs to be done in spite of fear. James Farmer. James Farmer lived his life according to this message of courage. James Leonard Farmer Jr. was born in Marshall, Texas in 1920. His parents were James Leonard Farmer Sr., a minister, and Pearl Farmer, a former teacher and housewife. It was clear from an early age that James was a child prodigy, and he graduated from high school at age 14, then enrolled at local Wiley College. While attending school, one of Farmer's professors knew his interest in ending segregation. He introduced Farmer to the studies of Mahatma K. Gandhi, and inspired by Gandhi and his methods, Farmer formed a plan of nonviolent protest against segregation. Despite these attempts, violence still continued throughout the protests he organized. Many of the violent actions included spraying down victims with powerful fire hoses, military dogs, and beatings in the streets and rioting. Farmer struggled with seeing the violence. He came up with the idea of freedom rides. Freedom rides were a quite simple and peaceful plan. They would carry protesters to specific locations at which they would march against segregation. The first freedom ride did not go exactly as planned. Angry whites burned the bus and beat the passengers, which included 7 blacks and 6 whites. Freedom rides later became more successful, but Farmer knew there was so much more he could do. Another idea, sit-ins, was born with his associate John Lewis. A typical sit-in would include both blacks and whites. The whites would refuse to be served until their fellow black colleagues were served first. Farmer attended Core's first sit-in at the Jack Sprat Coffee House. Upon arrival, he was informed that he was unwelcome. The manager of the restaurant noticed that white Core members and allowed them inside. After much negotiation, Farmer and the other black members of his party were finally allowed inside, but the manager refused to serve them. Other customers soon noticed what was happening and gave their untouched place to the closest black near them. After they had eaten and paid their bill, the manager ran out into the street and threw their money at them, saying he didn't want their payment. Farmer told the other members to leave it in the street so that they could not be accused of not paying their bill. Despite their victory at Jack Sprat, many other establishments still had segregated policies, such as segregated bathrooms and water fountains. John F. Kennedy, the current president, was aware of the violent protests and knew that it had to end, so he called a meeting with Martin Luther King, James Farmer, John Lewis, and other highly influential black leaders to discuss the civil rights legislation. Even though the civil rights movement was just beginning, violence and imprisonment continued. In many cases, protesters gladly went to jail for what they knew was right. In many cases, college students would often be seen marching around their campuses protesting. Authorities and dogs would come armed to the scene in case violence erupted. In many cases, protesters would resist being moved from the scene, which set off chain reactions of protesters fighting back. During such a protest, Farmer was caught and immediately arrested along with 3 other Core members. While in jail, Farmer contacted Martin Luther King and wrote to him about the upcoming March on Washington. Unable to attend, Farmer sent a letter with his speech enclosed. This speech was read at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, by Floyd McKissick. This speech is most famous for Farmer's words that the fight for legal and economic equality would not stop, quote, until the dogs stop biting us in the South and the rats stop biting us in the North, end quote. August 28, 1963. Over 250,000 people traveled to Washington, D.C. Some marched, some took trains, others rode buses, but all came to protest segregation. Many carried signs that often read, "Education is a right, not a privilege," or "We have a right to vote." People often sang songs such as "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around" and chanted things such as "Freedom Now" and integration. Although many spoke of the occasion, Martin Luther King wowed the crowd with his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. This speech is considered to be the capstone of the civil rights movement.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
During his arrest, prior to the march, Farmer was blinded in his right eye by tear gas. July 9, 1999, James Farmer passed away. His death was directly attributed to complications from diabetes. Farmer's legacy has lived on through the millions of African Americans that are able to attend college and graduate in a non-segregated community. Although Dr. King was not able to see it, his dream has become a reality, where his boys and girls can go to a school in a fully integrated community. Farmer started out with just an idea, but it grew into so much more. He highly surpassed the original goals of CORE. At first, CORE was made to destroy segregation and birth integration. Now, some of the brightest scholars are African American, and our country has its first African American president. Farmer made a promise to his father when he realized that CORE was to be his life's work. He met with his father, and his father asked him, "What do you mean to achieve by all of this?" Farmer responded, "I tell you this, I will destroy segregation." Although his father did not live to see his son's accomplishments, Farmer held true to his word by helping to end segregation in a peaceful, nonviolent way.
We shall